Good afternoon. Today, our guest is the brilliant Alden Whitfeld, and we're going to be talking about immigration. Hello, Alden. How are you doing?
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so
Um,
we're going to be talking about immigration, and I've read your articles because I don't believe in interviewing people if I'm not going to read their work. And we're going to start to talk about the link between immigration and wages. Are
mhm.
immigrants lowering the wages of native workers? And Alden, please go in depth. This is a really technical program. We like it when people explain issues in detail.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. So, for the past few decades, I would say there's kind of I wouldn't say consensus, but if you listen to a lot of mainstream economists, they will assure you that immigration either doesn't have an effect on native wages or employment, or if it does, it's very small, negligible, and they will provide all sorts of theoretical arguments for why this would be the case, right? Maybe labor markets just adjust very quickly. Maybe, immigrants and natives, they don't really compete for the same kinds of jobs, so there's not that much, room for displacement. But in reality, the and I guess before we get into the empirics of it, I do want to make this one point, which is, um, you know, people like people like me and people who are immigration restrictionists, we tend to hold the belief that immigration hurts native wages, and we tend to hold that position, I would say, pretty consistently, right? Whereas, the people who say immigration doesn't really hurt wages, they're happy to acknowledge that it does hurt wages when it is convenient for making a different argument. Like, well, immigrants hurt wages, and that's a good thing because we need to fight inflation, even though the actual effect that would have on inflation is fairly small. So, but
Or
in
that it
terms
could
of,
lead to automation.
yeah,
Yeah,
but in terms of the empirical literature side, the reason why so many of these studies don't find an effect of immigration on wages, well, there's a couple reasons, but the main one has to do with internal mobility, because historically, people would move from the countryside to the cities in search of opportunity, in search of a better life, and because cities are, centers of productivity and economic output, right? And that was the trend for basically the entirety of the last century until a couple decades ago. And starting a couple decades ago, that trend began to break. What you're instead beginning to see is a lot of natives, they are leaving the cities, they are moving out, and they are specifically, the more productive an area is, the more likely it is that a native worker will leave, which is, on its face a bit perplexing. Why is that happening? And this ties then back to the paradox in the immigration wage literature, because when immigrants move in, they have two effects on supply. The first effect is that some native competitors exit. Like they don't like these foreigners, they leave. So that reduces contemporary supply in a very easy to observe way. But they have another effect, which is because immigrants settle in high economic, high opportunity areas, they reduce the expected gains for natives who want to move in the future. So they also reduce future supply in a way that's harder to measure. And so this internal mobility dynamic, when you account for this, you see a very different picture. So the example that I like to use is the Mariel boat
I
lift.
was
Because,
just about to get to that example, but before you continue, I have to correct an earlier point about automation. The
yes,
influx of immigrant workers will delay automation. So because of immigrants, people are less
Yes.
likely to adopt technology. But when I said automation earlier, I was thinking in the context of high skilled immigration. So highly
Mhm.
educated and technical immigrants, when they flow into an era, they raise up prices. And when you raise up prices, employers have to account for those prices in wages. So in that long-term context, it could encourage investment in automation because wages are getting too high. But overall, immigrant labor, like slave labor, would
Yes.
delay investment in automation. I just wanted to
Yes.
correct that error.
Yes, that's true. There is actually I I actually did cite this study not too long ago where the authors looked at these Danish municipalities and they controlled for a bunch of like firm level characteristics, and they find that the share of non-Western migrants is negatively correlated with the rates of robot adoption. So there is at least some real evidence to suggest that immigration does delay the incentives employers otherwise would have to innovate and adapt. But I guess going back to the wage point, in terms of Mario, there's so the most famous and one of the most highly cited papers was the one by the economist David Card back in 1990, right? He he I believe he won like some prize for that study, but you know, his conclusion was that immigration doesn't really hurt wages. And then later on, you know, George Borjas, he reanalyzed the same data and he used a different approach, and he finds that the wage shock is real and it's about 10 to 30% in terms of the decreased wages. And, you know, Borjas's work has been criticized by others. So so one of the problems is the critics of Borjas, they use this method called synthetic control. Now, synthetic control isn't a bad method. It's not particularly appropriate, though, in the context of Mario, because for synthetic control to work optimally, you need a very long pre-shock period, and you basically need a lot of donor cities. And the two options that economists could have when it comes to analyzing Mario, neither of those are very satisfactory. So there's a study by I can't pronounce his name. Monras. He basically shows that when you account for the fact that natives leave when immigrants move in, you do see that immigration hurts wages. I believe their effect was that an increase in immigration of the equivalent of about 10%, the metropolitan steel cell results in a 10% decrease in wages for the workers affected, and that the wage recovery in Miami over that time period, about half of that was entirely just explained by natives leaving. And that, you know, that is huge, and that has some important ramifications. Now, of course, if the thesis was true, right? If it's true that natives really leave in response to immigration, then you would also expect the opposite to be true. And, you know, as it turns out, we do have good evidence on that too. Stanford economist Rand Abramovsky, he had a study showing that during the 1924 immigration restrictions, when the foreign-born share of the population collapsed in a bunch of cities, the loss of workers was almost entirely supplanted one for one by domestic migrants as well as immigrants from unrestricted areas. So you do see that pattern play out both ways. And the Okay, yeah. So the reason why this is important is, oh, okay, yeah. So what I wanted to talk about was, so David Card, he actually, now, David Card has actually looked before at the question of, does immigration cause natives to leave? Right? David Card is not unaware that this is possible. He had this study done a while back where he basically finds that immigration doesn't really cause substantial native outflows. So, of course, how could it be that David Card found that immigration doesn't really cause natives to exit, but Maras found that they do? The difference lies in the fact that David Card's method, which is called the Immigrants Network's Instruments Measurements Technique, they weigh small metropolitan areas close to the Mexican border much more heavily. Now, the problem, of course, is that internal migration tends to occur in much richer locations because that's typically where immigrants move to, right? And so David Card's method is basically more or less guaranteed to produce lower internal mobility estimates than is typically really the case. And internal mobility matters a lot. I don't think the average person really, truly, fully appreciates the scope of the matter because, well, I guess the way to put it is the way to highlight this is this. So after World War I and until 1945, the Soviet Union, right, had a huge increase in economic growth and economic productivity. But in reality, if you take a closer look, almost the entirety of that productivity shift is caused by an acceleration of the movement of Soviet citizens from the countryside to the cities, whereas actual productivity improvements within each sector did not change very much. But of course, that effect is still huge, right? So the reason why this matters is it's not just about wages, although of course that's a big part of it. The reason why it matters is because in Western countries, right, in almost every Western country, natives are more skilled than immigrants when you measure their PISA scores.
Okay,
And
Alden. So you're making this point to explain what issue because I want to talk about this issue
if I,
later in the interview.
okay, okay,
But
okay,
if you have a point in relation to wages, like different point but equally potent, feel free to
oh yeah,
discuss it. But the PISA
okay,
issue, we will discuss that at a later
all right,
time in the interview. And I will
all
use my black privilege to explain to all the lovers of third world individuals why they are wrong about the human people of the third world. And I will also be explaining. I interviewed Richard Anania once and I met him in real life. I will also be
oh
explaining
good,
why Richard Anania is wrong about an element in the immigration argument because Richard Anania some time ago said, of course, Europeans are disproportionately innovative because during the great age of migration, they were likely to relocate to America, but he's not right on that topic. And as somebody who was born in a third world country, I will explain later. But you can go ahead and continue to talk about wages.
okay. So there's internal migration. There's another part which is, I guess this one is basically what is the unit of analysis we should use when we measure immigration and wages? Because a very common approach until more recently was a very simple spatial approach, which is just, the share of immigrants in an area and like the log hourly wage of that area. The obvious problem is, immigrants don't they don't choose anywhere randomly, right? They choose the nicest places, the places with the best opportunities. And so the spatial approach is not really suitable for these kinds of analyses. Now, there is a study that was done in 2013. They basically look at they compare wage changes within the same occupation. And when they do that, then it's very clear that the effect is negative. Now, in this study, the authors' original results underestimate what the real negative impact is. And the reason for that is because in their initial analysis, they used 3-digit occupational categories, because when it comes to like different occupations, there are the groupings can be fairly broad or very narrow. 3-digit is fairly narrow. Now, the problem with that, of course, is some natives, right? If they want to avoid economic competition, when immigrant workers come, they will switch jobs. And so when you use 3-digit occupational categories, they can't really account for natives who switch jobs. So the way they kind of get around this problem is they do another analysis of 2-digit and 1-digit occupations. Because those categories are broader, it's more likely to capture the same natives, because they will change jobs, but they probably won't. The kind of jobs they do probably doesn't change that drastically. Of course, they will. In some cases, it will still like not properly capture them, but it will be less bad. And you do see that when you use broader categories, the wage depression effect is substantially larger. And the other thing that they show is that this wage depression effect is persistent. It's not measured just over like a couple years. In the case of this study, it was measured from 1994 to 2006, so about 12 years. So the effect is persistent, and this is consistent with what other studies find. There's one that tracked native. So there's one that uses census data and directly tracks the native workers who were displaced in the from the 1910 to the 1940 through the census, and they basically find that so young workers in particular were the biggest losers, and among the young workers that were displaced, that moved, their income losses were twice as large as the non-movers. And given the fact that they tracked them in like 1910, so they've tracked them for about 30 years. And the income loss is still there. So, of course, this then throws a wrench in like the commonly used argument often employed by pro-immigration advocates and often employed by Richard Hodalia, which is, the fixed pie fallacy, right? Which is that, in economic theory, the number of jobs it's not fixed, right? Because new workers, they will create new demand. And so, so they use that line of reasoning to criticize a lot of right-wing accounts for engaging in, what they call zero-sum thinking. But in reality, immigration provides a mechanism for the losses to be persistent, right? The effects are spread throughout the entire economy. Even if the pie isn't literally fixed, the adjustment is slow enough, and natives are forced out from the most productive areas of the country. And so because of those, I guess you can also talk about stuff like, monopsony power, but that's some other detail. But in general, what I'm trying to say is there are mechanisms that allow for persistent economic harm in even the long run setting. And the literature does suggest that these effects do exist.
Well, Alden, the deficit in the pro-immigration argument is that the literature is often examining the effects of immigration in developed countries. I'm a libertarian, I am not an identitarian. I am not in any way, shape, or form. I am an old school 19th century libertarian. I like Albert J. Nock. So I'm interested in free trade, free labor, markets, and the free movement of people. But if you are a smart person, you would have listened keenly when I said I am a 19th century libertarian. So obviously, if I say I'm a 19th century libertarian, what does that mean, Alden? It means I don't really like poor people that much. So no, seriously, yes. So by immigration, I'm talking about people who are smart and rich. I am not interested in the third world. And as somebody who's from a third world country and who has studied the literature, I can tell you that immigration is overwhelmingly positive in third world countries. Why is it positive? Because the flow of capital moved from Europe to the third world. So people migrated from Europe or North America and they went to places in Africa or the Americas, especially from Europe to places like Argentina and Brazil. One prominent historian said that modern Brazil is the invention of immigrants. I think his name was Ferdinand Brodel. Yes. I don't want to mispronounce his name, but it was that Brodel. It was him. He said that modern immigration, Brazil is the invention of modern immigration. So many studies show that immigrants from Europe, they enrich the third world. So there are studies on the effects of immigration on Argentina, on Chile, on Brazil, etc. So when the flow of capital is moving from a developed country to a developing country, what do you get? You get better schools, better universities, better technology, and better organizational processes. Because usually it is the organizational process that becomes the engine of growth rather than the technology. So if you import technology from America, but you don't have the processes to exploit the technology, you're going to fail. So when the Japanese were when the Japanese were industrializing, they imported Western technologies and also their mental framework along with organizational patterns. People really talk about process innovations. So if we want to study the positive effects of immigration, look at the flow from the West to the rest. So for example, the sewing machine is a simple device, but the flow of the sewing machine from the West to Africa made Africans more productive.
Yes, that is true.
So immigration, we do need more immigration, but we need more immigration from places like America and Sweden to places like Jamaica and Nigeria. We don't need people from those countries going to America and Sweden. In other words, what we really what in this is what I'm saying. Just this is what I am trying to say politely. Decolonization was an error. The decline of Western imperialism was a big error for the third world. And
In
I'm
terms
serious.
of
No, I don't think people really appreciate what the independence of the third world did to economic growth. When countries like the French and the British, when they left Africa, it was an error. They left at the wrong time. Developing countries were not ready for independence and were paying the price.
right, yeah, that is that is true. That's decolonization really screwed over the economic development of the third world, and you know it. The Europeans, it's not they left the third world countries with a lot of their infrastructure and technologies and even institutions, but the third world peoples, they, for the most part, did not maintain them very well. And
Not at all. They're like I sent you my book, Busting African Delusions. There's even an economic paper on transportation saying, look, those countries, they received Western infrastructure, but they failed to maintain it. It was as clear as day. They literally failed to maintain Western infrastructure. They fell into
I mean,
disrepute.
yeah, there's like a stereotype about, well, I guess it's less of a stereotype than like a description of like what's happening. But like, in South Africa, they the copper for the rails keeps getting stolen. So, like, it's like very basic. It's like very basic infrastructure that's needed for like a good standard of living that they're not even bothering to maintain properly, and it's like a very abysmal state. It's like some, and then you have like Western politicians who, they want to be morally virtuous and humanitarian. They, you know what, when people talk about like refugee policy or humanitarian immigration, what they're really saying, even if they won't ever like admit it, is how much of the world's disorders do we want to bring here? That's really what that is. Now, the pattern of immigration is very interesting because it actually also lends a point against an argument that pro-immigration libertarians make, which is that, someone like Brian Kaplan, he's a very smart guy.
Please, I interviewed him. He's really smart. Look, I interviewed many smart people, and he was the only guest who was not able to overturn. No, he was the only guest who was able to really overturn my counterpoints. And I've interviewed many smart people.
Yes, so he's a very smart guy. I just want to put that out there. Like, I'm not bashing him. I'm not like, trying to take a flack out of him. It's just his arguments on immigration. Like he says, for example, he says that okay, like for example, he gives this. He says in his book, right, the one that's like a bunch of like comic panels, the case for open borders. One of the points he makes is that he says a lot of anti-immigration economists, they're engaging in the arithmetic fallacy, because his point is that, even if immigrants lower the GDP per capita, that effect is purely compositional because you're adding in some poor people, right? And that's in reality, everyone is made better off because there are these large allocated benefits to the specialization of labor. Right. That's the argument. So like he has this thought experiment where it's like, if you have a society of all geniuses and then you let in like some mediocre people to do the menial tasks, the average genetic quality of that society goes down, but actually you see everyone is better off as a result. Now,
no, he's right. I'm not disagreeing with Brian. Do you know why Brian is right? If you are living in a successful society, and you import working class Ashkenazi Jews and working class Chinese people, we will all benefit because over time, the working class Ashkenazi Jews and the working class Chinese people, they will outcompete the native population. So they don't really converge to the norm. They excel. They go beyond the norm. The Chinese and the Jews. And this is the pattern for Chinese and Jewish people everywhere. So in that context, he is indeed right. If you take normal people from higher quality populations, then there's a point. But are we enriched if we import Jamaicans from the third world who are not at the highest level in their society? I don't think so.
No, that is the problem, which is when he makes his argument, he's mostly referring to low-skilled immigration to Western countries, right? But, the thing with Brian Kaplan's argument is this. If the way domestic migration, the trends of domestic migration is very telling, because if this argument was true, you would expect something else. And this has happened historically with European, German immigrants and Huguenots, right? That's when immigrants are genuinely very productive, and when immigrants are genuinely very skilled, what happens is they create these new opportunities, they create new centers of productivity, and domestic migration actually moves towards where these immigrants are, right? So the domestic migrants, the natives, they want to move in the same direction as where the immigrants are. if immigrants had a positive effect on the standard of living. Now, even if, and remember, when I say immigrants, I'm talking about like immigrants to Western countries, which is mostly low-skilled immigrants, right? Now, if even if immigrants had, like on average, no real effect on the standard of living to the places they moved to, right? The average effect was just null. You would still expect domestic migration to move to where the immigrants are because the same economic factors that are attractive to immigrants are also attractive to domestic migrants. But the pattern that we observe in reality, right, is when immigrants move in, natives leave. And it's interesting because Kaplan actually, he said that if immigrants were actually, of course, immigrant in this context, like in the modern context, mostly third world immigrants, if immigrants were actually bad for the economy, then they would be like the bubonic plague. And you would expect people to like flee. And because so many people would flee, real estate prices would actually go down. That's what he said. And the funny thing about that is, I don't know if you saw recently, but Garrett Jones actually had a post about this where he pointed out that this actually does happen in practice, that in some extreme cases, immigrants actually reduce the housing prices of the places they move to because so many natives leave.
I saw that, yes.
Yes, so like
People
and
see
also
immigration for negative than positive reasons. So for example, Asians work really hard, they do well in school, therefore white people flee because of competition.
yes. Yes. Yeah, with Asians, they induce white flight and not because Asians commit a lot of crime, right?
No.
That's the misconception people have, which is that like it's that flight is always about like they're criminal, they're dirty or something. It doesn't have to be that. It could also be caused by, just cultural differences in norms, just behavioral externalities that natives don't like. So, and in terms of international migration, right? The other thing, which is if the effect of labor specialization was so big, it was just at such a premium, because then you would expect that international migration should actually mostly be from the first world to the third world, because higher IQ would have a larger premium in poorer countries, right? Because it's more scarce.
That's what colonialism did, as we said earlier. That's why.
Yes, that's what colonialism did, right? In colonialism, you had the movement of human capital from first world wealthy industrialized nations to third world not so wealthy.
Let me give another example, Alden. So I studied history in school, and I like economics. And over time, I've appreciated that technology transfer became a problem in developing countries because of decolonization. So when Brazil was a colony, when Jamaica was a colony, there were people who advocated for R&D spending, and they did not only advocated for R&D spending, but people built R&D institutions, they imported foreign technologies. These days, Latin America and the Caribbean region, those two regions are lagging behind the West. And I said to myself, why are they lagging behind the West when technology is more ubiquitous? We live in a more globalized world, therefore they should not be lagging behind the West. I discovered by doing historical research that these countries are lagging behind the West because when they were colonies, the people who were really interested in science and technology and R&D were the Creole elites, and they migrated. They migrated. So, for example, from Jamaica, many of these families, they left Jamaica, especially in the 70s, some before. They migrated from places like Brazil, and the elites who were left behind did not care that much about R&D. They were not building research societies. They were not importing foreign technologies. The private sector is responsible for appropriating foreign technologies, not really the government. The private sector is the engine of growth. So when these countries were colonies, there were even planters who were subscribing to agricultural research journals. Since independence, that type of thinking has plateaued. So Jamaica's budget for R&D is probably nil. It's really low. Why? And this
Right.
is one reason why it's low, because even when Jamaica was a plantation colony, the planters, they were not resisting technology. Many of them were importing foreign technologies. They were especially in Brazil. In Brazil, planters were more interested in plant science and botany and getting the right seeds. But since independence, the R&D project has plummeted. Well, not somewhat. It has plummeted because the people who are now leading the natives, the average people in the Caribbean, they don't care that much about science and technology,
Right.
and that's
Yeah,
why the
that's
flow of technology from rich countries to countries like Jamaica has been limited. It's not because of racism. It's literally because the people who cared about technology, their descendants are no longer living in places like Jamaica and Brazil.
right. That is true. A lot of third world countries after decolonization and after the West more or less just opened their doors, the best and most competent people, the people who otherwise could have actually developed their own countries or like at least put in the work for it, they have an easier option, which is just move to the West, and that has made trying to pursue genuine economic and technological progress in these countries a lot more difficult.
Exactly.
That
It's really difficult to have economic growth without civil society. And there are few people who seriously study the evolution of civil society in Western countries. State capacity, that's measuring civil society. There is no state capacity without a strong civil society. Europeans developed a theory of political rights before building effective bureaucracies. Before bureaucracies, they had guilds and universities and professional societies. That's why Europe has state capacity. In developing countries, civil society is still a problem. Even in rich non-Western countries like Singapore and South Korea, many of their research organizations are owned by the government and not the private sector.
you think,
And it's really hard to have innovation without a civil society that can lower transaction cost and that can diffuse information freely without political interference. And civil society is still a Western concept.
yeah. That kind of reminds me. Who was it? Noah Smith? I forgot who. Um, some someone on the pro-immigration side said that. Okay, don't quote me on this, but I recall an argument was that this brain draining of the third world is actually it's good for the third world because it like incentivizes third world people uh, to acquire more human capital in the prospects of being able to move to the West. And but the the problem with this is they don't actually measure. So I mean, like the IQ is the single best measure of well, most of the stuff that we care about when it comes to socioeconomic well-being, right? And we also know that IQ is very hard to alter with environmental pressure. What these studies instead do is instead of actually looking at the measures that are basically IQ, they kind of look at, okay, do these brain drain countries, do the people in these countries try to pursue more professions that are like supposed to be supposedly more skilled, so like being like a doctor or something, right? But these occupational categories, they're not stable in the sense that, well, if you go to a country with a standard deviation lower in IQ, you also don't expect their doctors to be as competent, right? So
Well, I know
it
why I'm
could.
laughing. I'm laughing in my head, and I know why I'm laughing, and I will tell you later.
Okay. So, it's not like the doctors are like not as competent, right? So even if you grant that immigrants have this incentive to then like do these to try to get like certified in more professional roles, the question is, are they as good as the people that left? Because I don't think so. And this is not like something that these kinds of studies ever answer,
Well, I
right?
again, so let me tell you why I'm laughing, because usually on this show, I allow the guest to speak because the show is about the guest, not really me. But I have perspectives that other people might not have because I was born in Jamaica. Let
Mhm.
me tell you why that assumption is a fallacy. The
Okay.
diaspora IQ predicts social progress, economic growth, innovation, well being, technology. It's a primary predictor of their
Yes.
social outcomes. When the Swedes were industrializing, the smarter Swedes who had migrated, they returned to Sweden with their skills and expertise. In countries like Taiwan and South Korea, when those countries were industrializing, the smarter people returned with their skills and expertise.
Mhm.
Why did they return? One, they have the opportunity to become more eminent in their respective countries. And two, intelligent people are pro social and they think long term. And that's why the diaspora, as a panacea for growth, does not work for low IQ countries. Jamaican example. So Koreans have a Korea Finance Organization. They have the Korea Society, and the purpose of the Korea Society is to manage the brand of Korea by showing people that Korea is this amazing place that's ready for business and science and technology and everything that's good. So the Koreans, they have professional political and lobby groups in America. And one Korean said that the Jews are successful, we like their diaspora, and we are following the Jews.
I
That's what
do know that one. Yes.
yeah, that's what a Korean said. So
Yes.
he's the co-founder of the United Korean Founders. It's an organization for Korean entrepreneurs in America. So Korea is a high IQ country. Ashkenazi Jews, that's a high IQ population. When
Mhm.
you're talking about countries with lower IQs and lower human capital, their diasporas, one, are not as organized and they tend to be a bit petty. So in Jamaica, people from Jamaica who migrate abroad, they want to vote in Jamaican elections or they want to serve in the Senate. And sometimes, if they think that the government is corrupt, they will go abroad and demonstrate in front of the country's embassy in a foreign country to show that the government is corrupt, or they will complain by saying, when are we going to get the next Jamaican consul general to New York? Or they will talk about reparations, but they're not business oriented. They can't organize a Jamaican finance association on the scale of what the Koreans are doing. And that's why diaspora politics does not work for low IQ groups because they don't understand the purpose of a diaspora and how a diaspora should project influence in a foreign country. Into like I never tire I never get tired of laughing at the Jamaican diaspora. The silliest group of people ever. Yeah, really silly group of people. I never get tired of laughing at them. They're so invested in scandals in Jamaica or online gossip that they forget that the purpose of a diaspora is really to make Jamaicans influential in UK, Germany, or wherever. It's just like when Donald Trump decided to impose that $100,000 on foreign workers, the H-1B visa. Jamaican diaspora, some members of the diaspora were saying that won't affect most Jamaicans. They're right, but a smart diaspora would have said this policy won't affect most Jamaicans. Most of the people who will be affected are Indians. Therefore, Jamaicans should be exempt. That's a smart diaspora. But our diaspora isn't smart, and that's why if the person you're quoting is Smith, he's definitely wrong. Brain drain doesn't really help developing countries, and many of them don't have a smart diaspora that can flow technology back home.
I mean, I think it was Noah Smith. I'm not
Yeah, I don't
sure.
want to quote you because you don't know, but yeah,
If it is Noah Smith though, like he has Noah Smith has had a very bad track record when it comes to his takes on immigration. So This
But
wouldn't be the
like the
first
problem
time.
with the immigration debate is that it lacks an outsider perspective. Like Noah Smith is an American. Most of the people who talk about the issues are Americans, and they don't have
I
a
thought he was
non.
Canadian.
Well, Noah Smith is Canadian,
I believe he.
but
Well,
he lives in
now I
America.
have. Now I don't remember. Hang on. Noah's. Let me check. Actually, uh, oh, I know he is. He is
Yeah,
American. Yeah,
exactly.
my bad. I just remember that because he had some articles about Canada in the past that have also aged very badly.
You know, I'm not going to lie. When I was younger, like a high school student, early university, I read his blog. Like Noah Smith, he has a blog. I used to read it. But these I haven't read him in years, and I don't intend to. I don't understand how people read Noah Smith. He
I mean,
baffles me. He completely baffles me.
I mean, Noah Smith is popular not because anything he says is profound, but because like 90% of people generally agree with what he says because he just affirms like stuff that people mostly already believe in. No.
No, like I like Richard Anania's articles. I think Richard Anania is smart. I just don't follow him on.
No, I think
No.
yeah, I think Hanania he's like a troll and a contrarian, but like when he definitely he's not stupid.
Yeah, he has really
He's
good
not dumb.
articles on Substack. But I don't follow him on Twitter any at all. But I just don't get how people follow Noah Smith. Like I can understand somebody who's 15 or 14 reading Noah Smith, but by the time you're 20, I don't know why you would continue to punish yourself like that.
If you're 20, it's time to grow up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's punishment. Reading people like Noah Smith. Like Matty Gleason has some good pieces, but Noah Smith is just a no reader, none at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just like I'm not. I don't want you to think that I hate Noah Smith, but he's just not interesting.
Yeah.
There's nothing interesting really about Noah
Yeah.
Smith,
Um,
but he's really popular.
like he is. He makes a ton of money off his blog. So
Yeah.
much more than I do. I don't even make $1,000 a year off my blog.
Well,
So
I have like just over 100 followers on my Substack. Like I don't make enough money from Substack either. Your blog has grown quickly. I don't
I mean,
begrudge him for his blog. Like he's making money, good for him. I don't begrudge him. I just think people should use their time more productively.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Back to immigration. What's the
Yeah.
always housing affected by immigration?
I'm sorry. Say that again.
Houses.
Oh, houses.
Yes.
Yes. So immigration. What we tend to find is that. Well, okay, a couple of things. So a couple of effects, I would say. The first one is just most blunt. What's the effect of immigration on housing prices in the area that they move into, right? There's a couple studies done on that. Unsurprisingly, there's also meta-analyses done on that. To the surprise of no one, immigration raises housing prices. It's true that immigration also increases the demand for housing, but housing is one of those goods that it can't respond immediately to change to like supply shocks because it takes it takes a couple months to you need licensing. It takes a couple months to start building, and so it takes a while for the economy to like adjust. So that's in terms of like the areas that they move to directly. But oftentimes what you see is that immigrants actually have a much larger effect on areas surrounding the places that they move into. So not the places that they moved into directly, but the surrounding areas. Those areas, their housing prices and rent prices typically go up too, and oftentimes actually goes up more than the target areas, which seems to suggest that, a lot of natives moved out and spilled over into surrounding MSAs, right? So that's like the sort of more direct effects they have on housing. And I know Noah Carl, he did this analysis a while back because the Financial Times, right? They had this one piece a couple years ago about how the Anglosphere doesn't seem to really build many homes anymore. And they attributed this to, very bad regulations on housing that the Anglosphere has. And they used the UK as an example, which you can see that in the UK in their graph. Over time, the number of dwellings per 1,000 people has like declined. But Noah Carl points out that using the same data, when you actually just look at the absolute number of units that have been built over time, it has increased, and it has actually increased very quickly. So basically the entire reason why the dwellings per 1,000 people has gone down is because population growth driven by immigration is just that much more drastic that it can't keep up with this change. So, like, it's true that housing is one of those things that's multifaceted. Of course, if we had better supply reforms, better, the housing laws, like more YIMBY, YIMBY policies, that would be better. That would alleviate crowding. But all of these policies would work even better in a low immigration counterfactual. So those are like the more direct effects. There's the other one, which is, I think it's well known that in the West, immigrants and their descendants like voting for left-wing parties that are not very favorable towards pro-growth policies. And this is true, in the United States, and this is true in Europe as well. So the effect besides the effect they directly have is that they also, over time, make it harder to pass these kinds of policies, especially since a lot of housing policies is mostly done at the local level, right? So they absolutely have like very strong effects. I mean, in the United States, it's incredibly obvious in blue states. So, yeah, so
And
those
by
are
immigrants, we're talking about both Western and non-Western immigrants. So Western immigrants during the Great Age of Migration, they shaped American policy too. Many of them were left-leaning. They were socialists.
Oh, yes.
Tabellini,
Yes.
Marco Tabellini, I interviewed him some time ago. We had that
Oh, you did?
conversation.
Oh, that's awesome.
I
That's
did.
awesome. Yes, that is true that many people, like, I guess this is a good way to talk about the Ellis Island article that Emporium published recently, right? So a lot of people, they take kind of for granted that Ellis Island is the display of the success story of American assimilation. Now, in terms of assimilating the immigrants into a common identity, you could argue it has mostly worked. But in terms of actually erasing the underlying cultural and political preferences that the original European immigrants had, that has not worked anywhere near as much. And, Ellis Islanders, they supported big government. They supported the rise and the expansions of the welfare state, Social Security, Medicaid, all of these like programs that a lot of libertarians, dislike and say that has been horrible for the budget deficit and very fiscally unsustainable. They will make these correct observations while ignoring the fact that these immigrants, they help drive these coalitions. And Alex Norstef from the Cato Institute, the Cato Institute, he had this debate a while ago with Stephen Camarada from the Center for Immigration Studies, which I watched, and it's a very interesting debate. But one of the things Norstad says is, he says immigration restrictions, they've always been wrong. And he said that the expansion of the welfare state happened after, the immigration restrictions occur. And so, but this completely ignores the fact because
Why did the immigration restrictions occur in the first place?
yeah, like exactly. Like when immigration restriction was defended, you had people who were defending it explicitly on the grounds of like the concern that these Ellis Islanders, they come from countries not accustomed to small government, individual responsibility, and that if you let them in large numbers, they will change the politics of the country and they will change the policies of the country so that people become more reliant on the state. They've been talking about this at the time, and the obvious problem is that with immigrants, political integration takes time, right? It doesn't happen immediately. It's not like they show up, and the moment they show up, like they become lawyers, judges, and congressmen. It takes a long time for these processes to sit in, and so the effect of the Ellis Island waves on American politics and the American economic system did not really manifest until years later down the line, after the quotas already put in place, right? So when people like Doris Day say, oh, well, don't you know that the welfare state expanded during the time of restriction? It's like, yeah, okay, but who drove this expansion? It's the same.
And there were over 25% of the immigrants migrated based on some studies. Many of the immigrants who went to America, if they did not integrate, they returned home.
Oh,
Furthermore, those immigrants went to America to work and they benefited from private welfare. The private philanthropic organizations were willing to help immigrants from Europe. It's impossible to have a generous welfare state and mass immigration. That's a dumb idea. You can have a welfare state, but welfare should be limited to natives or immigrants from the third generation.
Yes, it's very it's interesting because the back and forth migration, the return migration during this era, the Jason Richwan, he has a study on the the preferences of different European American groups for wealth redistribution, right? Now there's two main takeaways that's visible from the results of the paper. The first one is the more obvious one, which is that, would you look at that? How much Europeans support wealth redistribution in the European countries predicts how much the European American group supports wealth redistribution, right? That's surprising to no one that's ever studied the literature on how persistent cultures are. But the second finding is in the study, the X and Y axes use different scales. And the reason why they use different scales is because there has been a strong selection effect, even among the Ellis Islanders, to be less pro-redistribution. Now, they are significantly more pro-redistribution than the original, Anglo-Americans, but on average, compared to their counterparts, basically every European ethnicity has an average lower score than their original countries, such that I believe Spanish Americans in his results are the most pro-welfare European American group, but even Spanish Americans are less pro-welfare than the average of every European country except Denmark. So the two takeaways is that there is a strong selection effect. At the same time, the Ellis Islanders, they still, their cultural preferences still mimics that of their original countries in terms of the relative differences.
Now we can talk about what Richard Anania said about immigration during the Great Age of Migration. Immigrants from Europe were closer to the frontier of technology. England industrialized, other countries followed, Before
Yes.
industrialized, countries like Sweden had relatively high human capital rates. The Dutch built the first bourgeois society. Europe was at the frontier of technology. Because Europe was at the frontier of technology, European immigrants were more innovative. If if Indian and Chinese immigrants were migrating to America at the same time, on at the same level, there's no evidence to indicate that they would have been more innovative, because India and China during the great age of migration were more traditional and they were not at the frontier of technology. So for example, the Jesuits and China, they went to
Right.
China. That did not spark a scientific revolution. Some have argued that when the Jesuits went to China, they were mixing Christianity and science, therefore the Chinese did not take them seriously. Others argue that when the Jesuits went to China, the Chinese used new science to justify old beliefs. Some scholars say that Europe had an idea of progress, the Chinese did not. They were more conservative. The idea of time in Europe was linear. In China, it was not. Therefore we don't have any evidence to infer that had Asian immigration occurred at the same level as European immigration did, the Chinese and the Indians would have been more innovative because they were not at the frontier of technology. And even today, Indian and Chinese immigrants have improved, but European, especially the Germans and the British, they are still disproportionately innovative. You have a paper on that topic. One of
Yes.
the paper, a blog. I read the blog, immigrants and entrepreneurship and immigrants and innovation, and you show data indicating that immigrants from Asia were not overly innovative.
Yes. Also, that's also something from the paper was, I think, for India less so, but for China especially. Well, sorry, for East Asia, I believe it was just East Asia broadly. So one of the interesting things was that for East Asia broadly, these being in a uh, being in a profession that is very skilled and geared towards innovation, such as being a scientist or an engineer, right? These kinds of roles, they predict actually making some major innovation less well for East Asian non-citizens in the US than it does for European ones. So that means that when you look at when you look at an East Asian scientist or an engineer, and you look at a European scientist or engineer, even though they have the same roles, the European one is actually more likely to end up actually producing some kind of novel
And
innovation.
why is that so? Let me explain. Let me tell you why I think that's so. I like to read Joel Moker. I wrote a review of his book, his latest book. He won the Nobel Prize recently. Innovation
So,
is really about one, your experience, your ideas, and your exposure to the process. So if
mhm,
Germans are really good at engineering and America has excellent engineering schools, it's still going to be hard to transfer German engineering to America, because it will take
I-
Americans time to master German engineering.
mhm,
Europe is still the pinnacle of innovation. The most innovative countries are still in America and Europe, especially in the UK. The UK is excellent at science. The UK's problem is the poor levels of commercialization. South
right.
Korea, Singapore, China, all of these countries in Asia, yes, on paper, they look innovative. They have nice R&D budgets, but they're still depending on Western technologies. So, for example,
Mhm,
Singapore is like the shining star in Asia. But what some people won't tell you is that in Singapore, the typical Singaporean is not interested in entrepreneurship. They would rather to work for a big multinational corporation, or a, they would rather to work for a big multinational corporation, or they
right.
would rather to work for the government. And
Mhm.
many of the innovators in Singapore are not from Singapore. They are multinational corporations or foreigners. So Europeans, they have what people call tacit knowledge, then industry specific knowledge. That's what the Europeans have.
The thing,
For the South Koreans, Singaporeans, they're at the post industrial level of development, but they're still not as revolutionary as we expect them to be. Look at even their GDP per capita. Poland,
right,
yeah, Poland is now doing really well. So East Asians, they work hard, they're smart, they work really hard, and IQ is important. But what is super important is what we don't talk about enough is individualism. That could be the most significant trait of Western society.
yes,
Individualism. It was because of individualism why the West surged ahead of the rest and not necessarily IQ. If you're
yes, it's, I'm sorry,
Yeah, I
go
was
on.
about to say that if you're an individualistic person, you will start civil society organizations. You will do independent research. You're going to be more pro market. You will deviate from the norm. In China, smarter people were having children, but they believe in Confucianism. They conformed, and there's a paper that explains this topic quite well, saying that in China the smarter people were having children and they were conformists.
Yes, East Asian culture is not very, has not been and still is not very conducive to innovation because, innovation, a big part of innovation is being able to think outside the box, but also like willing to be open to new ideas and the possibility of like upsetting the existing sensibilities. And East Asians are very much of the mentality of they don't want to rock the boat. And it's interesting because when it comes to national IQ and GDP per capita, East Asians, like you pointed out, are a big underperformer. Despite the fact that their national IQs are a couple points higher than European countries, they are not as wealthy in most instances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They are not as wealthy. They are lower in individualism and what some would call novelty seeking.
There's also I don't know if you saw this, but I updated the fractional counts of the nature index a while back. I believe it was for the year 2024. And I mean, with with what you basically expect, with the exception of Singapore, basically all the other East Asian countries have lower rates of per capita scientific productivity than Western countries do. So that's also consistent with them not being quite as innovative, even though, in a country like Japan or South Korea, they certainly have the formal institutions and necessary to do great research and produce great innovation, but they're so something about their norms is just not very
And I'm happy
conducive.
that you mentioned Singapore. I read Brian Chang. Well, it is Cheang. I don't know if it's Chang or Chiang, but I read his book comparing Hong Kong to Singapore. And he did say that relative to input, Singapore underperforms. So when you look at the input output ratio, Singapore is not as productive as we think it is. Based on their inputs, you would expect their outputs to be superior. So their innovation really input driven.
What outputs did they were
Yeah,
they
so I read this
measuring?
book. I can send you this book. He was looking at their R&D spending output and other data, and he did a comprehensive analysis showing that based on its inputs, Singapore should be more innovative, but it's really an input-driven, innovation-led model. So he was comparing
Yeah.
Singapore to Hong Kong, showing that Hong Kong has done better economically with less government support. So the creativity index measured Asian countries some years ago, and Singapore did poorly despite government spending.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this economist was making a point recently. He wanted to mock Eurocentric writers. He said, "Look, Europeans went to Africa and said that Africans are lazy, and today Europeans are saying that Asians are efficient and they work too hard." So I said, "Look, I like your research, but Asians are a bit overrated. When you look at their output, it is disappointing because based on their inputs, their output should be better."
Like the say goes, work smarter, not harder. And it's like
Exactly.
East Asians work very hard, but there are some aspects of the work they do which is like very inefficient and like or just like not even positive. I mean, I remember like at the start of this discussion, like we brought up how there's white flight in response to Asians moving in because Asians are very academically competitive, right? But did you ever read Arcto Theorem? Arcto Theorem has an excellent
Yes, I read
art.
him. I read
Yeah,
him.
yes, about the if one accepts the premise of Brian Kaplan's book about the signaling theory of education being true, then like the Asian like education culture is very bad.
Yeah, I
It's
read
like a
it.
very
Ryan called.
yeah. Yeah, so Asians work very hard, especially in academics, but like in academics, it's actually kind of a bad thing that they work so hard.
Yes.
Huh. Yeah.
Yeah, the key is really commercialization and bringing ideas to market. That's America's strong suit. So some people will say, look, America is not doing well on pizza, even though it was said years ago, long before Creamy used it, it was noted that when you disaggregate the data by race, Americans do better. But why do their scores look so low? We know why. America has two groups that help to drag down the average: blacks and Hispanics.
Yeah, well, we're still at a point where we can't explicitly talk about like race in that manner, which is a shame because a lot the because all of this information is extremely important, but the fact that it gets omitted in these sorts of mainstream and policy making discussions and decisions is like, it's very bad that these are left out
It
and
is no,
that
it's really shameful because people are saying, wow, our education system is doing poorly. And I'm saying, yes, there are flaws, but it's doing poorly because two demographic groups are dragging down the average. That's why it's doing so poorly.
like what it like this what it reminds me of? It reminds me of like this is like like I don't know how active you are on Twitter, but it's like a very common thing where, someone posts like a map where the Republican states do very badly on some measure, and then like another person like right below him like replies with a map of like the racial composition of the United States. Like that's what this reminds me of.
Yeah, like
Is
many blacks are now moving to more Republican states, more southern states because they are doing better. Yeah, so no, we know we understand the academic profile of America clearly. Massachusetts is a high IQ state. North Dakota is a engineering state and a hardworking state. Mississippi is a working class, not so high IQ state. So we have the data. The evidence is
yeah.
quite clear. We know how different states in America perform, and we know we even have good enough technology to analyze social data, so we can say, okay, there's a link between the percentage of this percentage of the black population and negative social outcomes. Their race at a cost. Their racial expenses. When you so I don't use Twitter frequently because Twitter is too unserious and anti-intellectual. So I don't have the personality for Twitter. But every now and then some stupid lady goes to Europe and she says, wow, I'm in Europe and I'm walking and it's night. And we're like, we know why you're walking like that. You're walking like that because Europe is not as diverse as America. That's why you're walking like that.
They do that with Japan as well.
Yeah, we
Japan
know
too.
now. We know. Look. I'm black. You know I'm black. You can't see me, but you know I'm black. And the truth is
Yes.
that in economics, there's this term we call negative externality.
Yeah. Yep.
Black people as a race, they correlate with many negative social outcomes. So, for example, health. There are some genetic variants that are associated with poor health, and they're more concentrated in the black community. If like America is predominantly white, it's a white majority country, even though the white population is in decline. But if you were to let how many blacks are in America? I don't remember the figure, but she's over 12% black. But if that figure
Yeah,
in
I think it's
13,
12%, but it's going down.
yeah, so exactly. But let's say for example, America has 50 or 60 million black people then, right? And we reduce that number to let's say we reduce the number by 90%. So America moved from having millions of black people to a few, let's say thousands of black people. We really, that's more than 90%. We significantly reduce the black population in America. Let's say the blacks migrated or they decide that America is boring, so they want to go to Africa. But for whatever reason, black people were to leave America. What
Okay.
will happen to America? America would save more money, less academic failures, less social problems, less childhood neglect, less black
Yeah.
women complaining, even though they're not
Oh my
qualified for
God.
the job. No, but seriously,
That's a paper one.
no,
That's a
no.
paper.
I am black, but I'm objective. There's nothing more irritating than when black people say, "Can you imagine America without us?" And I'm like, "Yes, I can imagine America that's peaceful and quiet."
Or I don't worry. I'm not making fun of you for it. Like I'm like laughing because like I've had plenty of those experiences like during my time in university too, and I'm just like, do you really want to know the answer or?
No, but seriously, we can like, and that's why I love when I'm not in Jamaica. Like I'm not in Jamaica. No, I can imagine living in a society that's not predominantly black. What do I get? Peace and quiet. You get up and you walk, or you're in your house watching TV and you don't hear noise next door. That's what you get. You get peace and quiet. So they're always saying it. Can you imagine America without black people? And I'm like, yes, some of us don't care about rap music.
Right. Well, it's kind of I'm sure you know this as well, but like historically, a lot of not so much anymore, but like I know in like the 19th and early 20th century, when the eugenics movement was taking off, like a lot of like black advocates themselves were eugenicists, and that they wanted various economic incentives to have the best and brightest among the
Well, yes.
among Black Americans to have more children.
There's this book by Willard Gatewood. I read all of it. It's about the black elite, aristocrats of color. And in that book, the black elites were saying that being elite is about good breeding. You can't
Right.
become elite. It's about good breeding. So one can't be socialized to become an elite person. It's about having the right stock. So you're indeed right.
Yeah, it's kind of just thrown. Everyone just forgot about that.
Yeah, you're indeed right. And even in the West Indies, there were some eugenic thinking blacks.
Yeah.
You're right. But I wasn't born American. Sometimes when I'm on Twitter, I'm just irritated because I've often said to myself, blacks are really high in confidence, but what they need is a little more humility.
Yeah,
They need a little bit more humility. They have too much confidence.
I guess you could say that about most non-white groups in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
US
most
and in
non-white
Europe.
non-white groups exactly.
Like they're always like, don't you know how important we are to like your society's functioning? And
No,
it's
you're
like,
not. No,
I'm,
no.
it's like, and it's like I don't know. Well, like I think you know, like the West seemed fine for like most of its history before you guys generously showed up.
Exactly.
Um,
No, like even look at places like Sweden and Denmark. Where would Sweden have a gang problem?
yeah,
Be exactly they're just so arrogant and the non-Western groups. No, can you imagine? Oh, let me tell you what's their problem. Their food. They think we can't survive without Mexican quesadillas. Yeah, that's the issue. Right? Chicken tikka masala. No, yeah, no, seriously. They think
Pure.
they think we
Oh
can't
my god, that.
survive.
I mean that. I mean, isn't that what Piers Morgan said? He was like when he debated Nick Fuentes, he was like, diversity is great, and his one argument is the food is fantastic, and it's like,
Yeah, they think people can't survive without their chicken tikka masala and their quesadillas. And they behave like this because they have been enabled by the majority in Western countries. They kowtow to minorities. I don't know why.
yeah, I mean, like it's white people themselves, right? Like this couldn't have happened if white people didn't let it happen. They and today, like they're the most vehement defenders of basically putting up with this kind of behavior from minorities because I think is from their perspective it's they want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt because when it is I think like smart people they there are certain things that like smart people are capable of that dumb people are not, right? But smart people they can't really imagine like how the mind of someone who's not very smart functions. And so they project like what they're capable of onto like everyone else and assume that everyone else has the same sort of level of civility and good faith and like rational judgment as they do, which is like engaging in this sort of cognitive error of sorts.
Let me give another example. So I like to read old books. There is nothing better than reading than reading history books that were written like in 1897 or 1900. Because when you read those books, you're like, what the hell? People were always like this. In the 1890s, people were talking about black crime.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. People, not only black crime, but black sexual disease and STIs. I'm like, what? They were always like, they even. I read this one economist. So he was writing an article about black people and height, and for some strange reason, he had data on the incarceration rate of educated black men. This is more than 80 years old. It's quite old. And he said, oh, yeah, the educated black men, they were more likely to be in prison. And he gave a good reason. And I'm like, okay, then. And this was a long time ago. So people will always be people. They never change.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of funny that I mean, like race differences in criminality almost certainly have a genetic component, but the black-white crime gap used to be smaller than it is now. Like it, of course, like black Americans committed way more crimes still, but in terms of how much more they committed compared to white people, it used to be smaller back in like the the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
And some people have given some people they have given explanations. They argued that systems like slavery pacified blacks. So after slavery was abolished, we're able to detect their true personality. That's what some people argue.
That's interesting.
That liberalism created the opportunity for the expression of their true personality. Because before rampant liberalism, they were controlled. So there was slavery, there was Jim Crow. People were always suspicious of blacks, but post liberalism, they're freer people. So now they have their true personality. So that's the best test case.
Yeah, I mean, liberalism is basically like it encourages everyone to like express like all of your worst tendencies, right? So that's what that's what you with modern liberalism at least, like you would get that the kind of the kind of expectation in the past that you had to be normal and that if you weren't going to be normal, the consequences will be enforced and it will be enforced consistently. Now that that's not really a thing, like, since like the 60s, like the black white crime gap has gotten much worse.
Yes.
So
Yeah, it has, as we said, and some conservatives they like to make the argument that black crime is because of the expansion of the welfare state in the 1960s. But I have read people like Monroe work. He was not racist or very conservative, but we have tons of data showing that no, blacks were always more criminal than average. There's this
they were,
guy called Frederick. There's a Frederick Amand. This other person McCord is really good. Yeah, I've read quite a bit of old writers, and the statistics every time are embarrassing.
yeah, I mean, I think besides the welfare state, the other explanation is like single parenthood, but like parenthood it's not really causal for criminality,
No,
right?
because relationships are
So
assortative. Delinquent men
these
date
are,
delinquent women, and they have delinquent children. It's assortative mating and genetics.
yeah. And actually, if you, there, this was like a study from like 2 decades ago, but like when you have an antisocial parent, but the parent is not present, so like the parent is actually not there, the child's outcome is actually slightly better. So it's actually like a little bit better that they're not around.
Yes,
So
there's this
like
guy called Anthony Walsh. I interviewed him before, and I've read his books, and he has made the same point that it's better to not have some parents in the home.
yeah,
Do you
yeah,
know
that
that
is
criminologist Anthony Walsh?
it's a Walsh. I, I swear I've probably heard of them. I just like I don't have the exact recollection off the
No,
top
but
of my
he's
head.
somebody you need to read. Like, I think he's the most interesting criminologist ever. He's in his 80s now, but he still writes. Like, he's really
Oh, okay.
interesting. That's the problem with society today. The most interesting people never rise to the top.
Yeah, where our society doesn't want them to rise to the top.
Yeah, it doesn't. Like, before we go, like, Jordan, have you ever listened to Jordan Peterson before?
Of course, like
Why?
everyone,
Why?
most people. Well, most people, like myself included, like we didn't start off like knowing HBD or knowing anything about like uh heredity. So we operated under this sort of like lying slatist, individualistic framework. And, at the time when I was just sorting out my politics, a couple years ago, like before I got into HBD, I listened to people like Jordan Peterson, mostly because, not because I was like really trying to understand like political theory or like I was really trying to like dig into the empirical literature. I mostly just did it because like at the time I was like I wanted to be like an anti-SJW, right? And Jordan Peterson was like owning his feminist and it was like so funny. And so I like watched like him and then like eventually I stopped watching or listening to most mainstream
Me
commentators
too. I did.
after.
I stopped like over 6 years now. I haven't listened to any of them.
Yeah, I basically stopped after like I got into HBD and I was like I had um that it's like that feeling you get when you have that moment of realization where you're like, wow, everything I've been told in my life is a lie. Um, And so, like, during that time period, I was like much more open to all sorts of new possibilities. Fortunately, I did not. it could have been worse, you know. I could have ended up going down like the rabbit hole of like, you know, like all the people now that like listen to Candace Owens or something.
Exactly like my point. Like, no,
So
there's
I
no,
did not end up as a political schizo, and
no,
I'm
listen,
at least happy about that.
there's
So
no greater evidence to show that you're stupid than love for Candace Owens.
yeah,
And that's why I can never respect Ben Shapiro because he hired her, knowing that she's an idiot. Yeah, I can
oh,
never respect Ben Shapiro because of that. Like, he knew she was loony, but that's a problem with conservative Inc. They like these crazy people because they drive traffic and they make a lot of money,
well,
but they
I
dismiss
feel like
movement.
they like I well, Ben Shapiro, like he obviously he didn't know that Candace Owens at the time was gonna go off on that tirade about like Palestine because but I think Con Inc. just likes propping up token minorities.
Exactly.
Like what this is. They just want token minorities because they can't explicitly defend the interests of white people. So if there's like some kind of policy change they want to achieve, they always get around the problem by like using some minority group as a shield. And like you see this the most clearly when it comes to Asians and affirmative action. Like affirmative action also discriminates against white students, but like 99% of the time, you're only ever going to hear about them talking about Asians. And, you know, after the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case came out and they said you can't discriminate against Asians, you know, Harvard did not become race blind. Harvard was basically like, okay, I guess we'll only discriminate against white people from now on. So,
Other than Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams, who is now deceased, Glenn Lowry, the man from the Woodson Center died. But other than those old black conservatives, do you know any conservative who's black and really serious, who's not old? Like Wilfred Riley is still young, could be in his 50s, 40s, but I've interviewed him before. But other than people who are not like established or getting old, is there any conservative who's like 20 or 30 who's worth listening to who's black? I can't really point to one to any really.
I'm trying to think. Well, like I'm not. Like obviously like I don't go out of my way to listen to like a black commentator, but like I know I've listened to some in the past. I'm trying to think about like the young ones.
I
Have I
can't really
listened to
find a young one who's really serious. Like they're funny, but you
no?
wouldn't say like serious, but they're funny.
Let me. I how young are we? Like 20s, 30s?
Yeah, 20 to 35, at least that.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I I'm not sure. I don't. Yeah, now that I can't think of any that's like
Exactly.
this is like I can't be accused of being a racist for not knowing black commentators in their 20s and 30s for like conservative and really well read on the subject. Now, can I?
They try to prop up people. Like there's CJ Pearson who became famous for shouting at Obama in a video. But he's a comedian. He's funny.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I don't. Yeah, I don't know anyone that's like 20s or 30s. There's not many. I mean, like, you know, I mean, also because I guess like conservative is a bit of a misleading word because a lot, you know, because like a lot of blacks, they have like, you know, they have a disdain for like homosexuals or something like that, right? But, you know, when we say conservative, we usually mean like Western aligned conservative. They're sympathetic to like the interest of Western civilization and like
Exactly my point. Like some
like
years ago, I wrote the same article. It was published in Chronicles, and I said, "Look, Black Americans are not likely to be a conservative. A conservative is not necessarily somebody who's a capitalist or even a Christian. Western conservatism is particularistic. You are preserving a particular character, a particular culture of a people. It's not solely about markets and free trade.
Yeah,
What
that's a that's
preserving?
a
Like if you're conservative, even though well Hegel is a bit complicated. Some people on the left claiming, some people on the right claiming. But the point that I'm making is that if you're a conservative person, you're really conserving the Western intellectual tradition. Even people like Kant, who's more on the classical liberal side, but you get my point. Conservatism is
yes.
not only about free. Many of the original conservatives, like people like Burke, for example, weren't in love with free markets. So when black people in America say that they're conservatives, no, they're just capitalists. What are they conserving?
Right. Like that's a very good point. And I've been trying to I don't write about this, but in real life I try to have this kind of discussion with a lot of people who are like Republicans, and one of the points I always wanted to get across is that like conservative is being used as a misleading label because like, you know, different peoples, different nations, they're different kinds of conservatives. Just because just because black people don't like gays doesn't mean like they have your interests in mind. If you think about the average Republican, right, their definition of conservative is like the average guy from like 1990 or something, right?
Yeah.
So like here's the obvious problem, right? Which is basically everyone in the 20th century would be conservative by their definition. And like in the 20th century, every country, every civilization was conservative. That did not stop them from killing each other or like hating each other or like constantly trying to undermine each other. And it's because they don't understand that like conservatism is not liberalism. It is not a universal label. It is specific and it, like you said,
Exactly.
it's particularist.
Exactly. So, for example, if you are American conservatism is quite different from European conservatism. Europeans, they are less likely to be fond of the free market. Their conservative type of politics economically is quite different.
Right.
Americans are basically Christian classical liberals. If we want our broader label, I would say Western conservatism. But if you are a conservative in America, you should care about the European conservative tradition because Americans, the original Americans were from Europe. And
Yes.
Americans like to extricate themselves from the European lineage. At least some of them do. But if you are conservative, you are conserving the European tradition. That's part of the Western tradition. And then there's also Ralph Raico used to write
Mhm.
quite a bit on the French classical liberal tradition or even the German classical liberal tradition because in Germany, a few people were conservative in a right wing American sense. Not a lot, but a few were. So
Mhm.
American conservatism is a bit divorced from the continental tradition, which is problematic because America is a part of the West. People in America, some
Right.
intellectuals like to talk about Western tradition and Greco-Roman heritage, but it's white. Like that's the issue with Republic.
Yeah.
You're white. You are a white person. You're
Yeah.
preserving white culture. What's unique to white people, and they don't want to say it.
Yeah, they really don't. They
And
want to.
that's why I had no problem with what the Smithsonian did some years ago. Rationality is a cultural value.
Oh, are you talking about that like
Yes,
infographic that
yeah, it is true. Like there's this book called The Cultural Values of the West, and rationality is listed as a value. Time orientation, time is money. Benjamin Franklin, that's a Western value. Objectivity, the nuclear family, these are all features of the West.
it's interesting that the Smithsonian's they tried to make this all sound like bad things. It's like this is whiteness, and it's like, well, what part of the list do you take issue with? Would you like to like tell me the problems you have, or
Exactly. The concept of a theoretical culture, that's also Western. So some
Mhm.
people say, okay, Westerners are analytical because they're individualistic. I say no. Westerners are introspective And because they're introspective, they're individualistic. They're individualistic. So the causal mechanism is from introspection to individualism and to being analytical. You're not analytical because you are individualistic. You are analytical because they're introspective.
Right.
And what's a theoretical? Do you know Ricardo Duchenne?
I might.
Yeah, Ricardo
Remind me.
Duchenne wrote this book, The Uniqueness of the West, and he has a new book, Greatness and Ruin.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yes, I
Yes,
do.
I read a review. I reviewed the second book and I read the first book, but I know Ricardo Duchenne, and I think he's the most important defender of the West today. He should be more popular. More popular than Jordan Peterson.
You could say a lot of people should be more popular than Jordan Peterson.
No, seriously. But many like Republicans, Republicans are just lost.
They are well, I mean, with Republicans, they always can trust the white vote, so they feel inclined to actually, like, you know, because it's not like with minorities, where minorities can just switch parties. Like, whites are not going to switch to the Democratic Party, so they can keep just treating, like, the white political vote as cannon fodder. And it's not been great. The I believe the recording has a limit of 2 hours, so we're like an hour.
More, so we're going to wrap up. So we'll be ending. So see you guys. So you can end it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me.